The scene is set on a Tuesday. On the Jewish calendar, it's the 12th day of Nisan. On the Roman calendar, that is April the 4th, AD 30. In just 2 days, the event that changes the course of history and the lives of men and women and children throughout the ages will take place. What is it? What's the death of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God, that will take place? Now, is this just a random date that has no significance, or was this event planned down to the most minute detail? Was this murder, or was it an act of love and compassion for a creation that had fallen into the depths of sin and degradation? We've just finished the prophetic teaching of Jesus known as the Olivet Discourse, in which Jesus reveals the destruction of Jerusalem, the signs that denote the end of the age, and the signs that will occur just prior to his return. But for him to return, he must first leave. His departure is not like any other. It involves a cross, an empty tomb, and a liftoff that doesn't require a rocket. In the closing chapters of the Gospels, we have the account of the events that led up to the most tragic and at the same time the most wonderful event in all of history, the results of which accomplished what no other man could or can do. Jesus accomplished the reconciliation of man with his Creator, a reconciliation that is available to all. But not all will avail themselves of it. Many will scoff at its mention. Others will run from it like it is something that is bad or that is evil. But to those that gladly receive it, to them it is life and hope for eternity. Our study today begins our series on the Passion of the Christ and the events that led up to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. So as we hear the unmistakable cry of the Jewish watchman's trumpet, the shofar, let's set aside this time for the study of the Word of God so that we can be alert and stand strong and remain faithful in these last days. Today we begin our study by reading three passages of Scripture. Mark chapter 14 and verse 1, Matthew chapter 26 verses 1 and 2, and then Luke 22 verse 1. Let's begin in Mark 14:1. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and to kill him. And then Matthew 24 verses 1 and 2. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." And then Luke 22 and verse 1, now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching. It's just 2 days away. Well, what is it that is 2 days away? Well, Matthew calls it the Passover. Mark calls it the Passover and unleavened bread, and Luke calls it the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover. Now, in the Mosaic Law, there are 7 feasts given that the Jews were to observe annually. The passages we just read are about 2 of those feasts. The Feast of Passover, which was 1 day, followed by the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. They were actually 2 separate festivals, though one immediately followed the other. Now, in first century Israel, and even among Jewish people today, these feasts have been combined in their thinking. And because of that combining, you'll hear people talk about the 8 days of Passover. But technically, Passover was just 1 day, followed by 7 days of unleavened bread. And by New Testament times, you find all 8 days called Passover and unleavened bread are just Passover, as it is here. Now, Jesus points out what his disciples already knew. that Passover is just 2 days away. Passover will begin at sundown on Thursday. Jesus now makes his fourth announcement concerning his death. But this time it's going to be different, because this time he even dates it. It's going to happen in 2 days' time. As was so often the case, they simply don't understand this until it finally happens. And when it does happen, it takes them by surprise, as we will see. Now, let's read that last part of verse 1 in Mark's account, and then verse 2 again. It says, "And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and to kill him. But not during the festival," they said, "or the people may riot." The gospel writers now reveal a conspiracy. Who's involved in this conspiracy? Well, it says it's the leaders of the Jews. Now, the leaders of the Jews here really consisted of two groups. First was the chief priests, which were known as Sadducees. Now, the religious responsibilities of the Sadducees included the maintenance of the temple in Jerusalem. You remember, it was the Sadducees, that the traders in the temple, that Jesus drove out. Now, these Sadducees held a very high social status that was reinforced by their priestly responsibilities, as was mandated in the written law, the Torah. The Sadducees also oversaw many formal affairs of state. Members of the sect of the Sadducees administered the state domestically. They represented the state internationally. They participated in the Sanhedrin, the high court of the Jews. They also collected taxes, which made them very unpopular. They equipped and led the armies. They regulated relations with the Roman Empire. They also mediated domestic grievances. And they were a very liberal group that did not believe in an afterlife or rewards or penalties after death. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Now, the next group were called the scribes and the elders, which are also known as the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees believed in and taught the oral traditions, the Mishnah, the oral law, and they held these traditions as sacrosanct or equal with the written law or Torah. They believed in resurrection and an afterlife and rewards or penalties after death. So the conspiracy actually involves both Pharisees and Sadducees, who were in one very real sense enemies and opposing factions. Now, the one in charge of this conspiracy is called Caiaphas, who is the high priest with authority over the 24 chief priests that headed the Sanhedrin. He's also a Sadducee. Now, what was their goal? Well, Matthew tells us the goal of their conspiracy in verse 4 of chapter 26. They plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. Now, as we shall see shortly, Judas will give them the opportunity that they're looking for. What's their goal? Their goal is to kill Jesus. And to do that, they plotted together, enemies joining, enemies uniting, plotting together to seize him by stealth. Why by stealth? Well, they were afraid of causing a riot among the people. Matthew's account in chapter 26, verse 5, says that they put an important constraint on their conspiracy. And what was that constraint? Well, they didn't want to nab him. They didn't want to grab him and kill him during the festival, during the Passover, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Otherwise, there might be a riot of the people. Now, this was an important part of their conspiracy. They would not carry out the conspiracy during the festival. Well, why was this? Well, at Passover time, the city was full. The city was crowded. People had come from all over Judea, all over Israel, to come and observe Passover at the temple. So they wanted to wait until after Passover, after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when the pilgrims would go back home and Jerusalem would turn to its normal, smaller size. Then they would carry out their dastardly deed. Now, here we have the satanic element in this conspiracy. Because while Satan wants Jesus dead, he doesn't want him to die at the right time, which is the Passover, or in the right way, which is by crucifixion. Now, we've read in the Gospels of many attempts to have Jesus killed. And it was always at the wrong time and in the wrong way, as it's going to happen right here. It was either going to be before or after Passover, or is in the wrong manner, as by sword or by stoning. You remember those accounts when they tried to get him or take him or kill him by sword or by stoning? Well, why is this important for us to note? Well, you see, if Jesus had died at any other time other than this Passover, or in any other way other than crucifixion, there would have been no atonement, and the prophets would have gotten it wrong. It was not merely the death of Messiah which was essential for the atonement. Otherwise, he could have died as a 2-year-old with the others in Bethlehem, and that would have been sufficient. But that would not have been sufficient. It would have been insufficient. His death had to come at the proper time, this very Passover, and in the proper way, by crucifixion. Therefore, attempts are made to kill him at the wrong time or in the wrong way. Not during Passover. But as we'll see, that's exactly when it took place. So keep this in the back of your minds, because we'll be coming back to this at a later time. Now, an important part of this conspiracy is also to avoid doing it on the night when they end up doing it, as we have already seen. They want to avoid doing it on the Passover. But before we examine this deed, before we examine all this, we need first to examine an act of compassion that actually winds up setting the stage and is somewhat the catalyst that leads to an act of betrayal. Now, this act of betrayal is recorded in Mark chapter 14, Matthew chapter 26, and John chapter 12. Now, let's read Matthew 26, verses 6 through 7. While Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. Now let's turn to John chapter 12 and verse 2. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume, and she poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. Now, John says he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. Note that. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Now, we need to look at this story. A couple things really are striking. First of all, where were they having the supper? Well, it says it was at the home of Simon the leper. Or should I say, Simon the former leper. You see, a man with leprosy would not be able to host such a dinner. In fact, he would not even be able to live in town. You see, he was a former leper. And obviously, he was one of the lepers that Jesus had healed when he performed one of the 3 messianic miracles, which was the healing of a leper. Now, this is taking place in Bethany. Now, what happened in Bethany? Well, it's at the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, who Jesus raised from the dead. These, plus Jesus and the disciples, are all together in Simon's house. And we are then told what Mary does. she does something that's very unusual and very costly. She takes a bottle of very expensive perfume and pours it over Jesus' head and feet. And each of the gospel writers describe this perfume as pure nard. Now, nard was a very expensive perfume, usually only used frequently by royalty, but even the most poor classes of women would have a bottle of nard that would be kept in reserve for their wedding night. Now, this perfume, according to John, was valued at 300 denarii. Now, to put that into perspective, the annual wage in Judea at that time was about 300 denarii, so a year's wages. Now, think about it for a moment. How much do you make annually? Well, that is what she poured out on Jesus' head and feet. Now, this caused a lot of murmuring among the disciples, and especially Judas Iscariot. He was upset about this. And according to John, this was because he was a thief that embezzled funds from the joint account held by the disciples. Now, look at Jesus' response in Matthew 26, starting verse 10. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you'll always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured out this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Now, Mary was doing this because she understood what was coming. Something his disciples did not understand. Somehow, she understood what Jesus had been teaching about his death and burial. And she goes ahead and anoints him for that purpose. Now, when we come to the section where the women come to the tomb looking for Jesus' body, we'll notice that this Mary was not among them. There were others named Mary there, but not this one. And why would she not be among them? She was one of the closest disciples, one of the closest followers of Jesus. Well, she wasn't there because she'd already understood and believed that he would die and rise again. She'd already prepared his body for burial, and she understood that there wouldn't be a body in the tomb. Therefore, there was no need to go try to find a body. So she doesn't participate in those Sunday morning activities after the resurrection. Now, how did Mary gain this understanding? Well, if you'll go back and read Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42, you'll see the story of Mary and Martha, and Jesus is there, and she's seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his words. And remember, Martha comes and complains that she wasn't helping with the meal preparations, but Jesus commended Mary for this by saying, "Mary has chosen to do the good part, which shall not be taken away from her." So where did Mary learn it? She learned it at the feet of Jesus, the feet of the rabbi, the feet of the teacher, which is where we are to learn, at Jesus' feet. Now, in Matthew 26, verse 13, Jesus points out that this act is going to put her in a place of honor and will be remembered, and obviously it is. So everywhere in history, wherever the gospel was preached and is preached, people spoke and will speak and continue to speak of this event as a memorial to her, just as we're doing right now. But for Judas, his decision to betray Jesus has already occurred by this point in time. John chapter 12, verse 4 tells us this. His betrayal of Jesus has gone down as the most outrageous act of all time. And what would cause a man to do this most hideous act? Was he demon-possessed? Or worse, Satan-possessed? Well, to find out, you'll have to join us next time as we continue to dig deeper into the final days of Jesus' life on earth. So until next time, or the rapture, whichever comes first, shalom.